You're all very welcome here tonight for the talk on G Farrell. My name is Mike Collins. I'm the Publications Director of Cork University Press, and we are the publisher of G Farrell's biography and letters, both by Lavinia Greacen. Lavinia's first book, G Farrell, The Making of a Writer, was published by Bloomsbury. But after a while that went out of print, and because we did G Farrell in his own words, the selected letters and diaries, Lavinia asked if we'd be interested in taking on the rights of the first book, so we did that. So we're a proud Cork publisher to publish one of Ireland's greatest novelists, who is in the select group of being a 2 times Booker Prize winner. So it gives me great pleasure this evening to introduce our 2 speakers. We've got Lavinia Greacen here, who I've just mentioned as the biographer of G Farrell, and we've got Jim Farrell's niece, Rosie Farrell, who's just starting out in her writing career, and I think I'm not sure if she's already done it, but she may be presenting some of her fiction at the open mic night this week. So, Lavinia, you're very welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I'm delighted that Mike is here, and also especially Rosie. And she's going to read to us certain passages from Jim's novels as we go through. And I'm very shy, so you must make allowances for all this. Now, few books become classics and outlive their author. Why do you think G Farrell's 3 Empire Trilogy novels achieved that? They certainly did. 30 years after his death, Troubles was awarded the Lost Booker Prize, making him that rare double Booker winner, one of those rare things, a double Booker winner. And the vote was international. I've just realized that I've forgotten to put my glasses on, which are absolutely vital. Where are they? If I can find them somewhere in my handbag, and you have to bear with me. I hope they're there. If not, we can go on somehow. Well, I can't see them, but never mind. I'll manage without. No, I'm sure yours might not work. If you forgive me reading my speech, because at my advanced stage, I think if I don't read it, I shall forget bits. And I'm very it's important to get Jim's own quotations from his own letters when I get to them absolutely right. And so here we go. So we have 30 years after his death, Troubles and the Lost Booker Prize. And 40 years now, admiration for all 3 books is still growing. Soon you will see ITV's new 6-part drama series of the Singapore Grip, which was filmed this year in the Far East. It's adapted by Oscar-winning playwright Christopher Hampton, who wrote Atonement, Les Liaisons Dangereuses, forgive my French, who not only loves Jim's books, but knew Farrell as a friend. Top film directors like Danny Boyle and Stephen Frears have competed recently for options on The Siege of Krishnapur. The reason all 3 books attract fresh financial investment, as well as an expanding fan base, is simple. As Salman Rushdie has said, had Farrell not sadly died so young, there is no question that he would today be one of the really major novelists of the English language. So did writing come easily to him? I think of him familiarly as Jim, not JG. And that's because I spoke to so many of his friends when I was researching the biography. Was his a straightforward, upward, smooth achievement? Let us see. James Gordon Farrell was born in Liverpool in 1935, the second of 3 sons. His Irish mother and English father had married in India, but the effect of the 1930s recession throughout the empire had affected his father's job, which was managing a factory in Bengal, and cut short their plans to stay on. Jim's early years in wartime England would influence his books, from his father's nostalgic tales of the Far East in blackout evenings to close observation of evacuees who were sent to board with them. His was what is termed a solid middle-class upbringing. At the age of 8, following his older brother, he was sent to prep school in Cheshire, where in due course he became head boy, and then on to his public school of Rossall, near Blackpool, the stepping stone to Oxford. Was it a smooth trajectory? Not quite. In 1947, the Farrell family moved to Ireland, settling near Dublin in Shankill, and regular crossings back and forth by ferry made the boy's dual outlook possible. For Jim, that double view would enrich all his writing, from his essays in school magazines to his future novels. Deciding without any enthusiasm to read law at Oxford, he first had to mark time for a couple of years from 1954, due to the backlog of wartime students. Ex-servicemen had priority. He spent a year in Ireland as a junior schoolmaster at the Protestant prep school Castle Park in Dalkey, and another year labouring in the Canadian Arctic. Read his books carefully, and you will find echoes of both. Always well-built and sturdy, a veritable stalwart on the school rugby teams, he returned home even more muscled up. At Oxford, Jim's only real ambition was to get a rugby blue, so he immediately joined the sporting club, Vincent's, and at every opportunity hurled himself around the pitch. In November 1956, curiously tired and disorientated after a long practice session, he went to bed early. When he woke, he was on his way to hospital and to many months in an iron lung. Diagnosis had been straightforward. It was, of course, polio, and the smooth trajectory, which is very hard to say, was entirely over. Now Rosie is going to read to us from the lung.
Nothing at all was moving in his chest, except his accelerating heart. It's important to will yourself to breathe, even if you don't feel any response. First in and then out. You mustn't try to breathe in the whole time. His heart was beginning to spin and his fists were clenched. After an eternity, the doctor closed the porthole and looked at his watch. Every day he lay a little longer, drilled by headaches, in that lifeless silence that stretched away towards the borders of suffocation. He knew that he would never cross the border and topple over the brink into death, but somehow he could never stop himself fearing that he would. All his attention was given to the intercostal muscles labouring desperately in his chest like mice on a hillside. His past he now saw as a long, perfectly familiar, perfectly straight road leading back to the distant horizon of his childhood. The familiar road had ended, and the future was a jungle through which he had to cut his way.
4 years later, years spent enduring physical suffering, grittily fighting back to partial health, and at the end, the compromised degree of modern languages, we find the dedicated writer, completely formed. Jim left Oxford without a backward glance, determined from then on to live on his own terms. The scars of his experience, more emotional than physical, are there to find in all his novels. He was to live in France for 2 years, teaching by day and writing by night. And at the end, he had the typescript of a book, influenced by Sartre and described by himself as a potboiler. And he had a title, A Man from Elsewhere. Creating it had been far tougher than he had expected, and now he had to rely on others if he was to get it into print. My book has failed, is still failing in the most irritating manner, he forced himself to disguise his anger shortly after his arrival back in London, where he was camping out in friends' flats. Everybody's saying it is excellent, but declining to publish it. Chatto and Windus came within a whisker. 2 directors out of 3, including Cecil Day-Lewis, were in favour, but they needed unanimity. They called me in for tea and gave me a nice paternal chat with Christian names flowing like buttermilk. So far, all I've had in return for my years of anguish and effort is 1 cup of tea without sugar. In fairness, I should add that I don't take sugar. But in the spring of 1963, the publishers Hutchinson took it for their new authors series, rating it a highly professional piece of work, without a trace of the self-indulgence they expected from young writers. Jim's initial delight was similarly pared down. I spent about 2 weeks in steadily decreasing euphoria, he wrote to a contemporary. I would feel better about my book if I thought it was any good, but I don't. Besides, it doesn't really seem to belong to me anymore. However, it does represent something to me, if only that I've got through the publication sound barrier, and it helps me to think of myself as a writer rather than a naive idiot. A Man from Elsewhere by James Farrell drew favourable reviews, and a good London agent was prepared to back him. Jim pressed on, living frugally, tensely, and solitarily. Twice this week, I've had nightmarish dreams about being isolated and unloved, he logged in his diary. But this must be inevitable when I'm writing full steam. I still believe myself incapable of writing when living in close contact with someone. All the same, this can't go on, and what terrifies me is that it will. I'm now fully conscious of this curious anarchy inside me that requires me to smash to pieces any promising relationship with a girl. Perhaps with care and self-control, there's no reason why it shouldn't be solved, like everything else, by exercising the mind. This time, the book drew on black humour from his nightmare polio experience in hospital, and he called it The Lung, as Rosie has shown you. A passage from it. He wrote much of it in Paris before returning to London, and confronting his ordeal made the process more tortuous and painful than before. When he first read it, he hid his reaction behind banter to a friend. The publisher was ultra-enthusiastic. He gave it to his readers, who were infra-enthusiastic. I should have been watching all this with the coldly sardonic smile of the genius watching lesser mortals make fool of themselves. But I had the sneaking feeling that the readers, 3, couldn't be wrong. Behind the characteristic-like touch, he was feeling even more exposed. Generally speaking, he was prepared to admit, I think it is better than the last, if only because it's more original. Content to live on the necessary shoestring, he was already concentrating on a 3rd book, a love story to be called A Girl in the Head. And by 1965, when it was nearly finished, he felt ready to apply for a glittering American prize, a 2-year Harkness Fellowship. By now, he was embarrassed by his early books, and he knew precisely what he wanted to achieve. I am deeply interested, he filled in the application form, in trying to write universal as opposed to regional novels, the sort of books in which people trying to adjust themselves to abrupt changes in their civilization, whether it be Ireland or in Japan, may be able to recognize themselves. Faulkner was reported to have said that nobody on a fellowship ever wrote anything good. I should like to prove him wrong on this score. Before publication of A Girl in the Head, he heard that he had been successful. He would be far away in New York when it came out. And now Rosie will read us from Troubles, the book he would write after the Harkness Fellowship.
By the time the inhabitants of Kilnaloch had noticed the glow in the sky and motored, ridden, or walked out to the hotel, the Majestic was an inferno. Streams of fire the size of oak trees blossomed out of the windows of the upper stories. Caterpillars of flame wriggled their way down the worn and threadbare carpets and sucked at the banisters and panelling until all the public rooms were ablaze. The heat grew so intense that the spectators were driven back with flushed faces, first to the edge of the gravel, then farther and farther back over the grass, which the heat quickly shriveled to raffia, until at last they were standing right back among the trees, gazing with shaded eyes at the blinding magnificence of the burning Majestic. By now, only the attics under the roof were recognizable, their windows still black and empty. Now, a hideous, cadaverous figure was framed for an instant, poised on the roof, his clothes a cloak of fire, his hair ablaze, Satan himself. Then he vanished and was never seen again in Kilnaloch, but he was thought to have swooped down to eat a meal of children in the infernal regions. For a few minutes more, the Majestic became brighter and brighter, until, like a miniature sun, it was impossible to look at it for more than a moment with the naked eye. Then, with a shuddering roar, it caved in upon itself, and an immense ladder of sparks climbed into the sky. On his last day in Kilnaloch, the Major paid a melancholy visit to the charred rubble, which was now all that remained of the Majestic. He did not linger there, however, because he had a train to catch. Besides, there was very little to see except that great collection of wash basins and lavatory bowls which had crashed from one burning floor to another until they reached the ground. He inspected the drips of molten glass which had collected like candle grease beneath the windows. He stepped from one blackened compartment to another, trying to orientate himself, and saying, "I'm standing in the residence lounge, in the corridor, in the writing room." Now that these rooms were open to the mild Irish sky, they all seemed much smaller, in fact, quite insignificant. As he was carefully stepping over a large pile of wood ash, which he suspected must have once been the massive front door, he looked back and happened to notice something white, half concealed by rubble. It was the statue of Venus, strangely undamaged. It was much too heavy for him to lift by himself, but when he got back to Kilnaloch, he made arrangements for it to be packed and shipped to London. As it turned out, this lady of white marble was the only bride the Major succeeded in bringing back with him from Ireland in that year of 1921. But he was still troubled by thoughts of Sarah. His love for her perched inside him, motionless like a sick bird. For many weeks he continued to think about her painfully. And then one day, without warning, the bird left its perch inside him and flew away into the outer darkness, and he was at peace.
Well done. Now, when I researched the book, of course, I went to Block Island, which is where the original hotel was. And these are, if I can show you, actual tangible remains of the fire. And that's in the book, in the novel, if you have read it. You have bed springs mentioned, and you have glass. And that is one of the burnt, very, very burnt bed springs. And this is some of the melted glass that had originally just been in windows and just fell down, and it shows the infernal heat that was generated at that time. Now, the generous Harkness opportunity, I'm so listening to that I've completely forgotten where I am, but I shall start again, gave Jim a place on the playwriting course at Yale, adding a filmic dimension to his style. And it proved inspirational, both imaginatively and practically. I feel that I should reduce my name from James Farrell to the simple initials G Farrell, he was soon writing to his agent and his new publisher, Tom Mashler of Cape. If I'm ever to do it, now is the time. I'm sick to death of being confused with the famous or notorious James T. Farrell. Every time he brings out a new book, I get commiserating letters from the awful reviews. Example, what's so nice about Farrell is he's so consistently bloody awful. It seems to me that having shuffled off my original publisher, there's no reason why I shouldn't shuffle off my original skin altogether. They agreed. True to his word when applying, the book he began there was about the Anglo-Irish in Ireland in 1921, a time for them of abrupt change. But returning to London when his time was up, it was still unfinished, and the name Troubles, which he'd already given it, was to prove frustratingly apt. It's as if when I'm writing, my imagination dilates and begins to gorge itself not only on the characters in my book, but on me and my private life. He was soon writing to a girlfriend he had left behind in New York. E.g., the Major has had a bad cold and felt himself forsaken by his friends. Yesterday, your friend Jim also got a bad cold and gloomily decided that he had hardly a friend left in the world. And by 1969, the familiar anguish of writing was back in full. For the past few months, he confided to a fellow writer, I've been possessed by this vast and dreary novel, a classic case of monomania, retarded development, and God knows what else. The research and rewriting seems like an unscalable mountain. On completion, his confidence, such as it was, plummeted further. It's due to be published here 10 days hence, he quipped to an old Oxford friend, and excitement is running low. I feel the tide is running against me. The suspicion became a certainty when I heard that it was coming out the same day as new novels by C.P. Snow and Hemingway. Yes, Ernest is getting at me from beyond the tomb. Ernest, of course, had died by then. Disappointed with his agent's advice, he had now signed up with a young, enthusiastic agent, Deborah Rogers. Troubles was published by Cape in the autumn of 1979, and his qualms proved unnecessary. It was unanimously awarded the prestigious Faber Prize. The win spread his name in literary circles, and invitations began to arrive, opening previously shut doors. As for the potentially smooth passage of achievement, however, there was little tangible reward. No less than 4 New York publishing houses have so far turned down my book, he fumed to a friend in America. No one has bought the paperback rights here yet. It is easily my best book. I'm talking about Troubles, incidentally. I can only conclude that publishing companies are staffed by idiots. I apologize. But Jim had already begun an engrossing new book, this time set around the mutiny in Lucknow, renamed Krishnapur by him, in 19th century India. When much of it was completed, an Arts Council grant enabled him to travel there to research. Necessary, but confusing. I had a firmer idea of what India was about, he said on his return, before I went. Ignoring Deborah Rogers' plan for him to stay with Cape, he entrusted his finished India book to the publishers Weidenfeld and Nicholson. Suddenly, everything happened at once. The 1970 Booker Prize, as we all know, was awarded to The Siege of Krishnapur. And Rosie will now read a section from that.
The first sign of trouble at Krishnapur came with the mysterious distribution of chapatis, made of coarse flour and about the size and thickness of a biscuit. Towards the end of February 1857, they swept the countryside like an epidemic. One evening, in the room he used as a study, the collector, Mr. Hopkins, opened a dispatch box and instead of the documents he had expected, found 4 chapatis. After a moment's surprise and annoyance, he called the Khan Samar, an elderly man who'd been in his service for several years and whom he trusted. He showed him the open dispatch box and the chapatis inside. The Khan Samar's normally impassive face displayed shock. He was clearly no less taken aback than the collector himself. He stared at the purple dispatch box for some moments before picking the chapatis out of it respectfully, as if the box had a personal dignity of its own, which might have been offended. The collector, with a frown, gestured to him to remove the wretched things. A little later, he overheard the Khan Samar shouting at the bearers, evidently convinced that they were responsible for a reckless practical joke. It is unlikely, given his other preoccupations, that the collector would even have noticed the second pile of chapatis, had his eye not been led towards them by a column of ants. The ants were issuing from a crevice between 2 flagstones, and their thin column passed within a few inches of his shoes on its way to the chapatis. The chapatis had a grimy and scorched appearance. Again, there were 4 of them, and they had been left on the top step of the brick portico, which provided the main entrance to the residency. The collector had stepped out onto the portico for a breath of air. He hesitated for a moment on the point of calling the Khan Samar again, but then he noticed a sweeper working not far away. He watched for a while as the man progressed, sitting on his heels and sweeping rather indiscriminately with a bundle of twigs as a broom. No doubt the chapatis on the portico were the property of the sweeper. The collector went inside again, dismissing the matter from his mind. The following afternoon, however, he found 4 more chapatis. This time they were not in his study, but on the desk in his office, neatly arranged beside some papers. Though there was still nothing very menacing about them, as soon as he saw them, he knew beyond doubt that there was going to be trouble. Disturbed, and having now forgotten the reason he had gone to his office in the first place, he made his way slowly back towards the hall of the residency, wondering whether certain measures might be taken to palliate the effects of this approaching but still hypothetical trouble, or even to avoid it altogether. Just supposing that serious trouble should break out in Krishnapur, an insurrection, for instance, where could we shelter? Could the residency, merely as a matter of interest, of course, be defended? As he stood in the hall, pondering this question, the collector experienced a sensation of coolness and great tranquility. During daytime, the light here came from a great distance. It came between the low arches of the veranda, across cool flagstones, through the green Louvre windows known as Gill Mills, let into the immensely thick walls, and at last, in the form of a pleasant, reflected twilight, to where he was standing. One felt very safe here.
Rob. Behind the austere name G Farrell, and a very tiny piece of information about him at the front of his books, was Jim the man. What was he really like? He was a good listener. He was mild in manner, whose attention brought out the best in people, reflecting their most likable side back to them. He was fairly tall and slim, with a legacy from polio evident in his increasingly stooped hock bottle shoulders. You know what a hock bottle is like. It's much more smooth down than the average bottle. And his premature grey hair. He dressed casually, but neatly, a light jumper, top shot button always undone, and only when absolutely necessary, a tie. Women were attracted to him, which he knew, and he was attracted to them in turn, as a procession of lovers, some overlapping, whom I met, confirm. But he had no intention of deflecting from the independence that enabled him to write. Marriage or cohabiting would endanger that, and he was deft at turning love into long-term friendship. Jim enjoyed entertaining in his cramped Knightsbridge flat, because ahead of his time he was a foodie. He had taught himself to cook. This comment about growing herbs shows his meticulous approach. I have a minuscule patch of ground outside my windows, which I'm gradually filling up with boxes of earth and plants. Plants including fennel, parsley, coriander, chervil, thyme, tarragon, marjoram, rosemary, lemon thyme, and bergamot. I think it's pronounced bergamot, not bergamot at the airport. Plus numerous others in seed form for next spring. Friends would be invited to gregarious informal suppers, good conversation, generously fueled by good wine, but hospitality was on his terms. He controlled his writing schedule rigorously, and callers were not made welcome. London suited Jim then. Smashing party the other evening, runs a typical letter. I saw Alison Nouri last night, and we were marvelling at how good vegetarian food could be. On the way home, I sat in a deserted tube carriage and read a copy of the Daily Mail I found there. It said that two of my friends were splitting up from their respective lovers. London Transport provides quite a decent service when you think about it. For such a private man, though, success on Booker Prize scale was a mixed blessing. He had announced an Empire trilogy in his acceptance speech, and the prospect of writing that third book, this time to be about capitalism and the fall of Singapore in 1941, was daunting. With his low energy from polio, calls on his time were disturbing, and he was now in the spotlight. He knew that expectations all round of his next book were raised. I'm badly blocked with the Singapore book at the moment, he noted in August 1974. I keep writing and rewriting the first few pages, and they get duller and duller. But the more I cudgel my brains, the fewer ideas I get. An entire year later, judging everything he had written to be unsatisfactory, he started the beginning all over again. My book is still uphill work, he reported to his parents in the autumn of 1975. I watched with great interest my old hero, Richard Hughes, being interviewed on TV. A High Wind in Jamaica by Hughes had been one of his favourite childhood books. When asked how many drafts Hughes did, he thought and then said, from 30 to 50. This is distinctly comforting to me. Concentration had not been helped by an exciting film option from David Lean, director of films like, now I have to read my own writing, Dr. Zhivago, Lawrence of Arabia, and Bridge over the River Kwai. The option had been for the Siege of Krishnapur. A research trip to Singapore, which Jim had extended to Saigon to observe US soldiers on leave from the Vietnam War, had also interrupted things. He had chosen to agent the next book himself as well. Eventually, Weidenfeld would be the winners, and there was a big advance for his next book. The Singapore Grip came out in 1978, and many reviewers expressed disappointment. Jim was hurt, but he was used to taking control, and he did so now again. I feel that life is much too comfortable here, he wrote candidly to a master from his old school, Russell, who had kept in touch. I've stopped experiencing things, in a rut, in short. The years go by in a flash. Also, I'm growing dissatisfied, more so, I should say, with the way I write, and that needs shaking up too. So that is why he came to live near here, in Kilcrahan, in April 1979. He was encouraged by the tax relief for writers, but mostly by having grown up in Ireland, with old friends still living in and near Dublin. He thought of himself as Irish, not English, but he liked the word cosmopolitan. At long last, the Singapore Grips deal had enabled him to buy a house of his own and to plan ahead, after all these years of unreliable landlords and scraping by. And the healthier air on this coast gave him more energy at once. Solitude did not bother him. He grew vegetables, planted trees, took up fishing, the first sport since his loss of rugby, and he had a new India book underway. He was reinvigorated, and he was happy. When I came here in the spring, and the weather was still cold and grey, he wrote to a London friend, a young man told me, just wait till the summer. It's like the Garden of Eden. And indeed it is. So let us leave him at that rewarding point in his life, happier, as he emphasized to a close relation, than I've been in years, with the passage read by Rosie from the Singapore Grip, the book that was already steadily earning him that contentment.
At first glance, Tanglin resembled any quiet European suburb with its winding, tree-lined streets and pleasant bungalows. There was a golf course close at hand with quite respectable greens. Numerous tennis courts could be seen on the other side of sweet-smelling hedges, and even a swimming pool or two. It was a peaceful and leisurely life that people lived here, on the whole. Yet, if you looked more closely, you would see that it was a suburb ready to burst at the seams with a dreadful tropical energy. Foliage sprang up on every hand with a determination unknown to our own polite European vegetation. Dark, glistening green was smeared over everything as if with a palette knife, while in the gloom, the jungle tends to be gloomy, something sinister which had been making a noise a little while ago was now holding its breath. If you left your bungalow unattended for a few months while you went home on leave, very likely you would come back to find that green lariats had been thrown over every projecting part and were wrestling it to the ground, that powerful ferns were drilling their way between its bricks, or that voracious house-eating insects, which were really nothing more than sharp jaws mounted on legs, had been making meals of the woodwork. Moreover, the mosquitoes in this particular suburb were only distant cousins of the mild insects which irritate us on an English summer evening. In Tanglin, you had to face the dreaded Anopheles variety, each a tiny, flying hypodermic syringe containing a deadly dose of malaria. And if, by good fortune, you managed to avoid malaria, there was still another mosquito waiting in the wings, this one clad in striped football socks, ready to inject you with dengue fever. When parts of the suburb were still bordered by jungle, it was by no means uncommon for monkeys, snakes and such like to visit your garden with the idea of picking your fruit, or swallowing your mice, or even your puppy if you had an appetizing one. But all I mean to suggest is that besides the usual comforts of suburban life, there were certain disadvantages too. Not far from where the Blacketts lived, Orchard Road sloped gently down, a gradient that was more psychological than real, almost straight for a mile or so, until it lost itself on the fringes of Chinatown and the commercial city, where Walter had his headquarters on Collier Quay and did battle on weekdays. Down there in the city, taking the place of the rats and centipedes which had once made it their home, seething, devouring, copulating businesses rose and fell, sank their teeth into each other, swallowed, broke away, gulped down other firms, or mounted each other to procreate smaller companies, just as they do elsewhere in other great capitalist cities. But up here in Tanglin, people moved in a quiet and orderly way about their daily affairs, apparently detached from these sordid encounters, detached especially from the densely packed native masses below. And yet they moved, one might suppose, as the hands of a clock move. Imagine a clock in a glass case. The hands move unruffled about their business, but at the same time we can see the workings of springs and cogs and wheels. That ordered life in Tanglin depended in the same way on the city below and on the mainland beyond the causeway, whose trading, mining and plantation concerns might represent wheels and cogs, while their mute, gigantic labour force are the springs, steadily causing pressures to be transmitted from one part of the organisation to another. And not just at that time, or just to Tanglin, of course, but much further in time and in space, to you thousands of miles away, reading in bed or in a deck chair, or to me as I sit writing at a table.
That's lovely. That's a lovely end. So I think there's a lot of concentration on Jim Farrell's death, always. But I think better to think of him alive, as he is there when he is writing, very much. Now we can, if you have any questions, we can take questions, but maybe there are none. Brett, how about you? You probably have one.
I do, but if I may, first of all, I'd like to thank Lavinia and thank you, Rosie, for a wonderful interpretation and the readings of your uncle's words, and for the insight, Lavinia, which you've given us. The question is this, and I was pondering it as you went through it. Thanks. Going back to the point at which Jim was applying for the Harkness Fellowship, and he wrote that he wanted really to expand the vision of his writing. And as he put it, I think you correct me if I'm wrong, that he wanted to move from dealing with regional issues to something which on a much broader scale. Now, he'd already done 3 novels. He was obviously successful in that sense, although he still had problems financially. But what do you think was, at that moment, it wasn't the Harkness Fellowship, he'd obviously already made the decision. What do you think was the catalyst for that decision to suddenly expand that vision to something which many people have called, it was really a political vision, that he was taking on the ills of civilization as he saw it? Can you think of anything that...
Well, I think when he wrote his application, he felt bored with London and having no money at all and everything. The great thing about the Harkness Fellowship, it was a very generous one. It gave you 2 years in America with income coming in all the time, good big income. Whatever you chose to study was laid out for you. And a car, you were given a free car, but one of the rules was it was to impress America and the impact of America and people around the world who were seen as people who would shape the media and shape people's impression of America. So if you were a journalist or a top writer or a top composer or anybody, and you spoke on your return enthusiastically about America, it was seen much better way than Trump's America First. It was a better way of promoting it. So that was why they were so generous. And one reason, and there was a sense of scale, huge scale. But also he was bored with his writing by that stage, and with writing in one small room. And when he went there, though, he was trying 3 different ideas for books. Each went wrong. And you can read in Trinity College, Dublin, his early attempts at writing, and then on the same page you have different little points where he's trying a different story and it doesn't work. But he couldn't think, he decided he wanted to do somehow Anglo-Irish. He thought, I'd better write about what I know, what I have experienced. He would have got the Anglo-Irish side from his mother's parents' family a bit. But not a lot, because they weren't the huge highfalutin Anglo-Irish of the great house, but they led a much more comfortable existence, slightly further down the scale, not very far down. And so he couldn't find a sort of how to engineer his book, how to start it. He knew what he wanted to do. He wanted to show people being confronted by suddenly rather terrifying change, and suddenly thought the idea of a hotel somehow might work, but even then he hadn't quite got that. And he went to stay on Block Island. He went to stay with a friend who who is still alive, very nice man, a painter, who lives in Venice, who I will see when I go back to Venice in November. And he said, Jim said to him, well, I just need to go somewhere miles away from everybody and just write and think. And he said, well, look, I go to paint on Block Island. Why don't you go there? So he did, and it's just a matter of taking a ferry from Long Island and going across. So he did, and went there and checked into the hotel. And you can see in the arrivals book, G Farrell, if you checked, in those words. And he looked across every day. On the harbour, there was a huge burnt-out ruin. And he said, well, what is that ruin? And so I said, oh, it's the Ocean View Hotel. It was the most famous one we had. Huge hotel, so exclusively booked into that you had to book from year to year. You booked ahead always, and you couldn't book in unless somebody had died. You got their space. You know, it was fun. It's like going to Cheltenham for the races and staying in the best hotels. So anyway, he looked at it and he thought, and he went up one day, and then he found, and that I went, of course, 40 years probably after he had gone. 75, and where would I have been? 1990? I'm not sure. Anyway, and I brought away these bits that were still there, and I doubt that you can still get anything like that now, because it's been all redeveloped, sadly. So if you read the book Troubles, you see all these are actually mentioned about the fire and what was found earlier on in the book. And it made him think, and he thought, yes, that is what I can do. And then you wonder where the hotel is located in Ireland, don't you? Then he relocated it in Ireland, of course. And where do you think it is? He said Waterford, but we don't really know. And so that was it, and that was the breakthrough. But it was lucky, but he was searching for that sense of scale. And then, of course, the book's scale would be much bigger than the rather narrower books he had written before. And then he was on the Empire treadmill. But how he's, I think he looked for a huge point of change at different points in Empire, and so he chose the Indian Mutiny.
He started at the perfect point then, which was the residual tension between being Anglo-Irish, the tension between the two. And do you think that therefore was the point from which, the logical point from which he expanded to looking at empire on a larger scale?
Yeah. And then he, capitalism, and he got very changed when he started investigating capitalism and the exploitive side of empire. He voted Labour, and whether he would now, I don't think he would approve of where Labour is at present. But anyway, whatever other. And by the way, now your nice friend Margie, who I know is staying with him because I'm staying with him, has had dengue, how do you pronounce it? Dengue fever, which was mentioned there. Yes. Poor thing, which is horrible.
That's one of it.
Anyway.
I just wanted to ask you about the style, because in the readings I noticed there was no use of figurative language, any metaphors, similes, or it's very straight, sort of pane of glass type of writing. I wondered if you knew what his main influences were.
Well, if you read my book, where I talked to mainly to people who knew him, and I wrote down what everybody said, and then edited it, obviously. It's like a reading list of advice, actually, if you, of all the authors that he read. If you just read copy down all the authors he read, and then you read that, you get a very clear path of how his style developed. And I'm not now, who is it who's written, and I read about her book when I was in Singapore myself this year, which came out, and she's a literary scholar in America, a librarian who's just retired. And she wrote one of these literary books which takes apart style. That's not me. I'm a biographer. I write the life of the person and how I see that life being influenced. What do you think?
I was actually wondering about Hemingway. I was just wondering about Hemingway from what we've heard today, I've read The Siege of Krishnapur. I haven't read any of the others, so, and that was probably when it just came out. So it was a long time ago, but I do remember. I remember it being a stunning book to read. I just don't remember the detail.
I'm glad you remember the adjective stunning. Well, he was very inspired by European writers and Russian. You know, not so much by English, and not very much by American, although he read American. There's a big difference in style between America and Europe. You know, not so much now, perhaps, but there was then. The head, really.
So at the beginning, you talked about his father and his life in India and that influence. But where else did he do his research? Because some of the detail that was read today, you know, just describing that suburb, I mean, you must have had enormous amount of knowledge that I can't believe was just based on stories his father told him. So have you any evidence that he read widely about culture and history and things like that?
He did, and he researched. He researched hugely and took notes, you know, and came back, and he would put little notes. He had strips on the back of his door and pin these little notes of things. For Singapore, he took the map. He had a map all the time, so he knew exactly where the streets were, how they lay it out and everything. And then when he got there, of course, he took the map. And being Singapore, where you suddenly get a downpour of rain, the map got wet, and when it got wet, it then tore. All the seams tore. And so he was always putting it together and trying to work out quite where they were. And he talked, and he read the Straits Times avidly, as I do when I'm out there, still. And you know, he talked to anybody he met. What was it like living there? You know, he was terribly interested in the minutiae, however you pronounce that, of life, the detail, which I think makes his book so lovely, because he includes it all. So he travelled in Singapore, so, you know, firsthand, and he travelled in India. But when he travelled in India, he found that more baffling. So he added an awful lot when he came back of detail. But he found the experience of being in India not what he had expected. They always tell you as a writer, write about what you know, which is why his first book was about Ireland, because it was there. He knew an awful lot. The detail was in his own head that he could include. Things about weather.
I think also hearing my granny talking growing up, she also was very sort of incisive, and she would notice details of things. So when I'm reading them now, I see bits and pieces that I suspect she has described to him. You know, just a bit about having to cope with a house in a tropical climate. You know, it is, I don't know for certain, but that's my suspicion, that that's the sort of story that she would tell. And she was very interested in telling, you know, the kind of the details of things and noticing the sort of slightly dark humour of things like that. Yeah.
She did, and she was a very good storyteller too. It's I think as somebody and I was born in England, and I envy people in Ireland. There's a natural storytelling gift, and I think that she had it very much, and I'm sure more than her husband.
Yeah.
But he was full of stories, and he read to the children when they were small, all three boys, and he had been deafened. He had something called tinnitus. Is that how you pronounce it? And so he couldn't hear very well, and it meant that if they never interrupted him, because he'd say, what, you know, and he'd been knocked off. So they learned at a very young age just to be quite, unlike most small children who would be interested, would plunge in and do all sorts of things. They didn't. They were very respectful in that way. And so he would talk. And the period of, 1939 to 45, it's 6 years. It's quite a long time in a blackout. And in the evenings, you had to black out every window. And you could have a light on, but you wouldn't use a great deal of electricity. We wouldn't have our great 100-watt bulbs and things that we have now. Quite low lighting. And his father would either read to them as light, and as you say, your grandmother, she would sew and darn and do things. And he would read wonderful stories and read stories from books that they would not have chosen themselves at that young age, you know, from a library. They would have just missed them out and read them later on, but he read them to them then, at the time when the life of the mind and the door of the mind was wide open, and so it all went in. I think they were very fortunate there. And they were competitive. They played sport a lot. They were a sporting family. Your grandmother, very sporty. And so that even at mealtimes, they played games like define that, or so-and-so. Everyone else would plunge in and criticize. You know, they refined you. And I think her father very much was used to reading, and so he would read out a whole sentence and say, now what's wrong with that? You know, they wanted to come out with this. So he made them think in a way that perhaps they might not. But then only one became a writer.
Yes, although my dad has something in the drawer as well.
Has he?
Yes.
Oh, good, good, good.
Yeah.
We have to see what that is.
Okay, thank you very much, Lavinia and Rosie, for giving us details of J.G. Farrell.
Thank you. Thank you.
Lavinia, 2 books are available from Kate at the back. I'm sure Lavinia would sign them for you.
Yes, of course.
And thank you all for coming. Thank you.
And if anyone wants to look at any of those more closely, you're more than welcome to come up and touch them or see them. Direct contact with the source of troubles.